I wanted to start out by noting that Donald Trump is President of the United States. And he is famous or infamous for, among other things, and there are a lot of things, for saying that climate change is a hoax. I think this is very important. We have exactly 20 years right now, according to the current rate of carbon emissions, according to the trillionth ton data, before we reach the climate cliff. That is, we're at the point with we have enough carbon in the atmosphere to generate a 2 degrees Celsius global warming. And in science, that's often treated as the point of no return, the irreversible, they talk about it as the point of no return, the point of irreversibility. The reason is that there is reason to believe that once we get to that point, 2 degrees Celsius increase in global average temperature, that we will no longer be able to control the process. We will no longer be able to mitigate it. We won't be able to intervene to alter the situation. And also with the feedbacks coming into effect at that point, all the feedback loops and the increase in methane from the tundra, the melting of the Arctic ice that diminishes the albedo effect, and so on, it's likely to accelerate. And the science says that at that point we may get to 4 degrees Celsius very quickly, 4 degrees Celsius increase in global average temperature. And scientists are saying that that is the point at which global civilization may no longer be possible. And they're talking about it in terms of this century, and the timeline is within the timeline is on a lot of these things is within the time span of people in this room, many of the people in this room. And so it's extremely important. This is a planetary emergency, and not simply because of climate change, because of crossing all the other planetary boundaries as well. This wasn't really part of my talk. I thought I would mention it though, because there's a danger that we get into a scholasticism where we forget about what the real issues are. I got my doctorate in political science at York University 32 years ago. Leo Panich was on my dissertation committee, no fault of his own, and that was 32 years ago, and I came out of the Department of Sociology armed with a critique of political economy, and particularly applying that to monopoly capitalism. And I went off to teach, as so many of us do. And 3 years later, James Hansen went before Congress and told the entire world that climate change was real. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was established. And at that point, I shifted my focus from simply analyzing the economic contradictions to capitalism to analyzing the ecological contradictions. And it's very important to understand that, armed with a critique of political economy, I could perceive difficulties that the natural scientists, the people who were talking about it, didn't perceive. I could see the contradictions more fully because I had studied Marx. And this is very important. They had an analysis of climate change, and still do, but they left out one thing: capitalism. They had no social analysis accompanying it. So the main issue was, how do we develop an ecological analysis that is a sophisticated social analysis so we can deal with the problem? And that was interrelated with the critique of political economy. And it was only gradually that I realized that Marx, almost by accident, and I didn't believe it at first, that Marx had worked a lot of the methodological viewpoint that we need for ecological analysis out. And that's what I'm going to talk about here. None of this was part of my talk, so I'm really, hopefully, I can manage the time. What I wanted to say was Marx's, everybody knows the subtitle to Marx's Capital. It is a critique of political economy. And what I wanted to suggest was that we can also see it as an ecological critique of political economy. This isn't so far-fetched, because we would normally think of it as an economic critique of political economy, but Marx was not that narrow. He was a materialist, and he incorporated a broader materialist critique into the critique of capitalism, which took account of both the materialist conception of history, we can connect that to his critique of political economy, and the materialist conception of nature coming out of natural science. And he saw these things as related. And this was a product of his whole development. We can see it in this ecological critique as evolving from the influence of Epicurus's materialism on his thought. Of course, Marx did his doctoral dissertation on the philosophy of nature, on ancient Greek materialism. And this is fundamental to understanding how he approached things, as well as Feuerbach's humanism and Hegel's dialectic. It's also evident very on in his treatment of the alienation of nature along with the alienation of labor in Capital. I mean, in the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. What I want to focus on here is broad outlines of how this worked. And I want to ask a disturbing question. Why is it that contemporary Marxist theorists, while not commonly acknowledging the ecological dimension of Marxist thought, nonetheless marginalize it as if it were a minor and exotic issue, especially in the context of the Anthropocene? How is it that we can continue so often to ignore this aspect of his thought? And I want to ask, how is this related to the rejection of any relation of Marxism to natural science, which came to characterize Western Marxism beginning in the 1960s? It wasn't characteristic of Marxism before that, quite the contrary. But it came about when Marxism revived in the 1960s. These aren't simply academic queries, because we have to deal with the planetary emergency. We're living in the Anthropocene epoch. We have to understand the relation of this to capitalism. We have to understand how a dialectical and historical analysis will help us in this respect. Rosa Luxemburg once wrote that Marx's great scientific achievement in Capital transcended the immediate needs of the movement. She said, its immeasurable field of application was not utilized or even fully discerned by the socialist movement that followed. And she wrote, only in proportion as our movement progresses and demands the solution to new practical problems do we dip once more into the treasure of Marx's thought in order to extract therefrom and to utilize new fragments of his doctrine. And we have to ask ourselves, why did Marx refer to natural science all through Capital? You can read Capital without seeing anything he said about natural science. I was trained to read it that way. But if you actually read what he says, you read his notes, natural science is all the way through. And it's true he used the cell as a metaphor partly, but actually there was a great deal of integration of these natural scientific conceptions into the materialism that he saw as underpinning capitalism and the larger physical universe. Now, what I want to point out is, so he had this materialist conception of nature as well as the materialist conception of history. Of course, he was not a primary researcher on the materialist conception of nature. He was a social scientist primarily, but he integrated those scientific results into his analysis. And this is crucial, and this is how any kind of critical scientific view evolves. In Marx's materialist dialectical view meant that he, as several of the speakers have stated, looked at the commodity and the processes of commodity production in dual terms. He defined the commodity as consisting of use values and exchange values. And this is very important because use values were associated with production in general, with the material conditions, with the physical nature of the commodity. Exchange value is related to the valorization process, the abstract labor, the creation of abstract value. It's this contradiction that Marx actually said. He said that this distinction was the most important methodological discovery in all of his work, and he made this contradiction the core of his entire analysis. So what we want to do is to try to put this together dialectically, and there's an obstacle here because there's the whole question of the dialectics of nature. What I was taught in my very first critical theory course at York University all those decades ago was that you have to read footnote 2 of chapter 2 of History and Class Consciousness, where Lukács questions Engels's version of the dialectics of nature. If you read the whole book, which most people don't do, you would recognize that Lukács didn't abandon the concept of the dialectics of nature entirely, as later critical theorists did. It's a complex problem. He talked about, in Dialectics of Nature, he talked about the merely objective dialectic, as presented, say, in Hegel's doctrine of essence, where you focus on the ever-present processes of part and whole, movement, repulsion, reciprocal interaction, negation, qualitative transformation. All of these ways of understanding are part of what Lukács called merely objective dialectics. It's an aspect of dialectical thought. We tend to think of dialectics usually now in terms of internal relations. And that's a very important aspect of dialectics, but that's sort of the more subjective aspect of it. I would say that you have to have a dialectics of internal and external relations, and we have to bring the earth into our analysis, and maybe even the sun and the stars. In other words, the physical universe. Marx actually had this point of view. He went ahead and he developed an analysis of what he called of metabolism. He used the concept of metabolism, which arose out of the cell science that Bob was talking about. He used the concept of metabolism, which was central to the analysis of cells, of energy, and even evolution, and he started to integrate it, beginning in the 1850s, into capital. He was most influenced in this respect by his friend Roland Daniels, who was a physician-scientist. Physicians often moved into general science in those days, and a communist, and was caught up in the Cologne communist trials and got, I think it was tuberculosis, and died shortly afterwards. And Daniels wrote a book called Microcosmos. And I think he only had one reader, a man named Karl Marx. And Marx, later when Daniels died, he praised Daniels more than anyone. Marx was not inclined towards praise, and the praise went through into the skies. It's almost embarrassing, especially coming from Marx. But he thought highly of Daniels. And Daniels had introduced the notion of metabolism in order to develop a kind of what we would now call a rudimentary ecological systems theory, where you're looking at how metabolism could be used as understood as a systemic regulative concept, tying together the plant and animal communities and so on. And Marx immediately took this up. And originally he kind of de-ecologized it and dealt with it more in social terms, and then he re-ecologized the concept, particularly under the influence of the German agricultural scientist Justus von Liebig. And he started to use the concept of metabolism to understand the complex systemic relations between, and dialectical relations between nature and society. It was brilliant, and Marx introduced the notion of social metabolism. And he defined the labor process, the labor and production process, as the metabolic relation between human beings and nature. So you can't think of anything more important in capital than the labor process. And Marx defined that, and he defined production in terms of metabolism. Not only that, he developed the most radical concept of sustainability ever developed. He said no one owns the earth. All the people and countries on the world don't own the earth. They only hold it in trust as bona patris familias, good heads of the household. And he said to try to own the earth, or the land, the ecology, the soil, was a form of slavery, and was akin to systems of slavery, and this would be understood. And he used the concept of metabolism also to define socialism. He said his most explicit definition of socialism was that the associated producers rationally regulate the metabolism between themselves and nature in such a way as to conserve their human energy while fully developing individual and social needs, satisfying individual and social needs. So Marx integrated this fully into his analysis. Not only that, he introduced a concept, the universal metabolism of nature, to talk about natural conditions in general and their systemic qualities. And he introduced the notion of the irreparable rift in the interdependent process of social metabolism to look at ecological contradictions, particularly between human beings and the soil, and the loss of soil fertility and soil nutrients. So he had this whole framework. The irreparable rift in the metabolic process was for Marx a statement of ecological contradiction. It meant that we had distorted our social metabolism under capitalism in such a way that we were undermining our relation to the earth and the reproduction of the earth and natural conditions. And so we were we were basically creating a social metabolism that was in contradiction with the universal metabolism of nature. I'm not making this up. It's in the analysis. It's not something that we generally talk about in Marxian theory, or not as much as we should. Ecological socialists talk about it. But in this day and age, this is very useful. Lukács said that orthodoxy in Marxism has to do with method. What we're trying to do is retrieve the method that will allow us to deal with these problems. As Bob pointed out, Marx's close friend E. Ray Lankester, who was Darwin and Huxley's protege, and I could tell you a lot more about him, but he emerged as probably the leading ecological critic in Britain in his day. He was the leading zoologist in Britain in the generation after Darwin, and he drew on some of these ideas, and he was a materialist and a sort of Fabian socialist is the best way to describe him. His student was Arthur Tansley, who introduced the ecosystems concept. And it was based on this same fundamental concept of metabolism. Metabolism became the basis for the notion of ecological systems theory. But Marx himself went on, even after Capital, to try to deal with the ecological contradictions he discovered. This is best explained by Kohei Saito. I'll just mention a couple of things. He studied the role of coal deposits on urban development in Britain through the writings of Canadian naturalist Grant Allen, and took detailed extracts in his notebooks from the work of British geologist Joseph P. Jukes on the way in which isotherms, or the Earth's temperature regions, were related to species extinction through climate change over geological time. Long before climate change crisis made this a contemporary historical concern in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Marx took careful note of Jukes' statement, "The extinction of species is still going on, man himself being now the most active exterminator." Now, when I was, we used to have discussions about, well, what happened in the last decade of, how many minutes? So, what happened in the last decade of Marx's life? Why wasn't he finishing Capital? Well, all of this was related. All of this was crucial. He was focusing on agriculture and ecological crises, and it was part of a materialist conception. I want to bring up, I don't have very much time, but I'm going to bring up a couple of things. One is there's been a tendency lately to use the term appropriation. Some Marxist ecological thinkers have adopted the term appropriation to talk about the extraction of ecological surplus from the Earth, the planet, from the environment, and as reinforcing the economy. And it's used as a kind of an equivalent of exploitation in the ecological realm. But I think this is a major mistake because Marx made it very clear. He said in the very beginning of the Grundrisse that appropriation is the basis of all production, the basis of all life. The free appropriation of nature is absolutely necessary for understanding how we live, how production occurs. The appropriate term is actually expropriation. And a lot of people now talk about Marx's so-called, his section on primitive accumulation, which is a mistranslation. It should have been primary accumulation. And he entitled it so-called primary accumulation. But he didn't like the term. What was the term he used? The term he used, and Balabar noted this in a different way, was expropriation. And all the way through his analysis, from the economic philosophical manuscripts on, he insisted that the expropriation of the earth, the expropriation of the land, and was essentially expropriation of labor, but also expropriation of nature. It was a form of robbery. And this set the conditions for capitalism. When you talk about economic relations, all economists talk in terms of quid pro quo or equal exchange. All economic theory is based on that abstraction. But the truth is that the system isn't simply based on equal exchange. Marx's theory of exploitation was based on equal exchange, showing how surplus value was created in that context. But there's also robbery. Liebig talked about Rabau, and so did Marx, and Rabau-Wirtschaft, the robbery system, or the robbery economy, where there was a plundering of the earth. Marx talked about the expropriation of the soil of Ireland for the basis of the English economy, the actual shift of the soil and manure from Ireland to England. He talked about the guano trade. He talked about how in the center of one part of the globe is converted into chiefly an agricultural and raw material field of production for supplying the other part, which remains a preeminently industrial field. So he talked about the pillage of ecology, of unequal exchange, and we need to think in terms of expropriation. And when Marx talked about expropriation, expropriating the expropriators, he was talking about giving people back the control of the earth, the control of nature, the control of production. Okay, I want to just mention 4 criticisms that are being leveled now at ecological Marxist theory, and why I think there are ways in which people avoid. Marxists have, for a long time, as Tim Pernero famously said, have tried to avoid materialism. That the last thing you want to be if you're a Marxist is a materialist. But we need to rethink what materialism is, and particularly given that we're living in a time of planetary emergency. And one thing is, when all of this work has been done on Marx's ecological thought, one criticism that comes out is that the people who are doing it, including myself, are just trying to say that Marx was right about everything, that he was politically correct from the standpoint of contemporary green theory, and that his ideas are simply sufficient to solve today's problems. Well, that's absurd. Nobody in their right mind would argue with that. What we are interested in is examining the analysis so we can get at the methodological basis for understanding the critique, an ecological critique of capitalism, or an ecological critique of today that's informed by the contradictions of capitalism, which is what is absolutely necessary to build an eco-socialist movement. And the thing is, you cannot find an analysis that connects the social and the ecological or natural, and I don't want to sound dualistic, they're dialectically connected in a complex way. You can't find an analysis of it outside of Marx, basically, outside the Marxian tradition, because of the reductionism that dominates still, and because capitalism is left out of the equation, and because people don't understand the dynamics in those terms. The other thing that's often said is that, well, Marx and Engels believed in promoting heavy industry. But there's a funny thing. They wrote over 100 volumes, and nobody's ever found a single sentence where they said that. And so it makes you think, well, maybe they were thinking about things in a different way. For example, Eric Hobsbawm wrote in his Age of Extremes, no discussion of rapid industrialization with priority for heavy industries was to be found in the writings of Marx and Engels. Think about that. In 100 volumes, they didn't, and it's true, they never made a slip where somebody could say, aha, they're Promethean industrialists, right? But you can find that in the texts of almost all other thinkers in the social sciences up to the present day. The third I wanted to, it's now, the metabolic rift is sometimes called dualistic. For example, Marx said that he wrote that capitalist production disturbs the metabolic interaction between man and the earth. World ecology theorist Jason Moore has recently criticized this as a dual system approach characterized by a nature-society divide. Outlooks such as those of Marx and Engels in the 19th century, according to Moore, are to be rejected as reflecting a Cartesian binary that posits two metabolisms, one social and one natural. To be fair of Moore, he doesn't actually attack Marx. He attacks me and a few others, but we were simply saying what Marx said. So the point is that if this is undialectical, it's rooted in Marx itself. Yet logically, Marx's ecological argument in Capital is no more dualistic in this respect than it is to refer to the heart as distinguished from the entire body in an attempt to examine their interactions. In any dialectical systems analysis, it is essential to abstract the part from the whole in order to learn about their interaction and the various mediations that lie between. I won't go on, but this is Bertel's point about the importance of abstraction. We can't understand everything except in understanding it as a dialectical relation between the part and the whole. And the part and the whole, and we have to abstract that in various ways. But the part and the whole means two things, right? Even though you understand that human beings are part of nature, and it would be absurd to think otherwise. This is the earth, and we're on it. We're part of nature, and we have to be able to abstract to some extent capitalism from natural processes, and look at the contradictions, and that's part of dialectical analysis itself. I was recently criticized, along with Naomi Klein, because we had titles like capitalism. She had a capitalism versus the climate as a subtitle for her book, and we had Brett Clark and Richard York and I had Capitalism's War on the Earth as a subtitle of ours. And there was a big article in this new tradition of critique that said, we can't say that because capitalism and the earth don't exist apart from each other. Well, we have to be able to deal with this problem. To simply identify capitalism with the earth is not going to help us. Marx said in the 1844 manuscripts that abstract thought is nothing in itself, that the absolute idea is nothing for itself, that only nature is something. Marx has also been criticized for ignoring intrinsic value. Okay, and this is my last point. So he's been ignored for ignoring intrinsic value that, somehow he didn't identify with the earth. And, this is a complicated issue. I won't go into it, but you can find in Marx discussions of the abuse of animals in production, and he was horrified by it. As I already pointed out, he was concerned about the issue of a species extinction. And you can look at his aesthetic analysis, which is based on the notion of the classical notion of sensibility, of aesthetics, in which it's connected to the senses. And he very much tied human beings to nature in that sense, and said that one of the things that human beings produce is the idea of beauty. Now, and that's the way in which we have to look at issues of intrinsic value. So I think that there's a lot to learn here. We need a method, we need to build on this, we need to take it and apply it to current conditions as we've tried to. But we do need an ecological critique of capital, and Marx actually takes us a long ways down the road. And although Rosa Luxemburg said socialism or barbarism, Marx once said, in looking at the ecological ravages inflicted on Ireland, he said, ruin or revolution. I think maybe we need to think in those terms.